the Agronomist. Last week we talked a lot about prolonged heat stress and its effect on our corn crop this year. So today we're back for part 2, where we're going to take that same angle but consider how it's affecting our soybean crop.
Yeah, so soybeans seem a little bit different. I know looking at a lot of soybean fields, I got one here to show and tell, but it just seems like the soybeans aren't showing it as much. So it's a good question right now to ask, how is the drought stress affecting the soybeans? Is it affecting them, as bad as the corn? When we see corn rolled up, everybody knows we're having problems. It's stressed. However, corn is a factory. We talk about that a lot. There's been a lot of pictures I've noticed on Twitter and stuff lately about spraying a corn plant, seeing how quickly it grows, how quickly the corn plant can grow. Really is truly amazing. But it focuses really hard on that vegetative growth right now to get up to flowering. So it's pushing as many of those leaves out, which are already determined. It's pushing those all out as fast as it can. And the more heat, the faster it's going to push them out. But with all that growth, it needs a lot of water. Soybeans are a little bit different. And unfortunately, we're kind of seeing the repercussions right now. I keep talking about closing the rows. Ideal yield scenario for soybean is having the row closed. We're right here at the summer solstice essentially this week, so that's when we want the row closed. We're not there yet, especially in 30-inch rows. Only maybe the narrow rows have a row closed. But when it comes to soybeans and drought stress, we're not seeing, and maybe severe cases on sand, you're seeing some of the characteristic signs of leaf clamping. A lot of times you'll see the leaves fold over on themselves. They're showing their, kind of like a tree before rain. It shows the silvery side because there's much more photosynthesis that happens on the top side of the leaf. So it's reducing its stress, it's reducing the water intake in its own ways. It's just not quite as visible as corn is. So the first thing that really starts to slow down with soybeans is that canopy. So it focuses more on the root growth, the below ground growth, than it does above ground. And a lot of times it reduces the leaf size. It just kind of shrinks everything up and just slows down. So all of this above ground is going to slow down. So it may look like, man, have they been growing? It just looks like that for a long time, maybe even a couple weeks. They just don't grow very quickly because they're focusing on everything below ground, which is very important to a soybean plant. If it establishes that root system, gets nodulation started, those important things, then when it gets a rain, it's going to be able to take off really quickly. So that's kind of the impact that you see. In general terms, soybeans are not near as affected early season by drought stress as they are late season. We talk about this a lot, but especially with fungicide applications and stuff, that critical time really is seed fill. Those that that have the opportunity to irrigate know this pretty well, but the time that you really want to make sure you're irrigating is when they're going into seed fill. So R4, R5, when they're starting to really pump the nutrients into the seed is important. If we get drought stress then we're going to start seeing issues because it can still abort flowers and pods at that point when it's trying to put them on. So really right now the biggest thing is it's not closing the row from my vantage point. Small leaves, limited growth. We've probably reduced, in many cases I've talked before about when soybeans have the nodes initiated, that's about V5. So this plant here is only V3. So by V5 it's got all of its nodes determined. So it's probably shortening up the number of nodes that it's going to have at this point because it's still determining them. So we may not see 18, 19 nodes. It may only be 15 nodes on this plant. So those kind of things are limited that it can still determine. But in general, what you're seeing is above ground, just limited growth on the soybean plant.
Okay. So some other questions that have come in over the last week revolve around herbicide applications and some of those tough decisions we're having to make applying when it's hot and dry. What are some things we can expect from that?
Yeah, it seems like that's been a really common topic lately. But it's for a good reason. Everything is stressed right now, so that's part of the problem. You gotta kind of think that through. The other thing I didn't mention, when the soybeans are stressed, just like any plant, weed included, anytime it's stressed, its first thought is, I need to reproduce. I need to, make seeds essentially. So it's gonna speed up that flowering process. And even last week I was out in some soybean fields and saw a couple flowers starting, which is probably just due to the heat. We've had a lot of heat and the dry stress, so the GDUs do add up when it comes to soybeans. They are dependent on that early season vegetative growth. It's not all about the night length at that point. Once we get to the summer solstice, they start flowering, then they pretty well stage according to the night length and what they've got left in the season. But so you got to think about that. So they're starting to flower. You don't want to necessarily spray inside the flowering window for soybeans. That puts added stress, just like corn and determining an ear. So that's one thing to think about. So on the herbicide side, I've actually sprayed some Roundup just in my own yard and stuff here lately. And even in the field setting, it's really slowed down. So any systemic herbicide like Roundup, anything that goes in the plant and works down through the plant, pulled through the plant by water, needs water to move. So it's really dramatically slowed down the time that it takes to kill that weed. So in terms of effectiveness, the systemic herbicides are not near as effective when it's this dry out. Just a lot of times weeds can also develop a little more of a layer on the top of the, more of a waxy layer that kind of repels more of the herbicides. So things like crop oils and stuff can help. But the other side that I'm going to talk about is the damage to the crops themselves. So just to get back to that, the systemic herbicides are going to be worse off. Contact herbicides will do better in the heat, but in terms of getting in the plant with those systemics, it's probably better to spray early in the morning. You kind of see the crop recover, the plants recover in general. You want to hit them when they're actively growing. We always talk about that early in the spring. So get them when they're kind of recovered from that drought stress early in the morning is better off for a lot of those systemics that you're trying to get into the plant. So just to keep in mind on the crop side of things, the damage that can occur. So and most of these things that we're using, maybe not an extend spray situation, but a lot of cases we're using things like crop oil or certain surfactants that help get it into the weed better, which it helps us get a better kill, more efficacy on the spray. That can also harm the crop. So when we're in these kind of situations, especially when we're hitting temperatures over 85, 90 degrees during the day, that really is, especially if the crop is stressed, that's what we're talking about. The more stressed the crop is, the more it's going to potentially damage that crop. So, there's no general easy guideline. You got to use, contact, your local provider and agronomist that you trust. But maybe backing off on some of that things like crop oil concentrate and things that can really damage the plant. Don't be spraying on the top end of that. I never like to recommend reducing rates of herbicides, but we're in a scenario right now where things are not growing very quickly. So if we have to come back and spray a little bit later, it's not ideal to be, in flowering and so forth. We still got to pay attention to that label, but the rows are not closed yet. So that's a challenge in soybeans especially. My opinion would be to spray now, get the weeds the best you can, spray early in the morning, any way that you can control those weeds and get ahead of them, because they're going to beat the soybeans out. Weeds are just naturally better at that. Most of the ones we have, especially the pigweed family, water hemp, any of those, a lot of those come from drought areas, so southwest and so forth, the U.S., so they're just better at handling dry conditions, so they're going to outgrow our corn and soybeans and look healthier, unfortunately. So yeah, it's just important to remember those couple of things. Crop damage when things are stressed, but also how effective or not effective the herbicide is. Contact herbicides are still going to be effective, but you got to remember those will, going to cause more crop damage too. So it's a trade-off.
Definitely a trade-off. Good tips for early morning application though. So third question for you today then, Phil, as we keep going down this drier path, what are some things to keep in mind as we consider next steps for our soybean crop?
Yeah, so I kind of just mentioned the one about herbicides. I would recommend trying to stay, ahead of them flowering if you can, at least with that first application. If we have to come back in, it's obviously everything's a year-by-year thing. There's certain herbicides you can't spray when they're flowering, and you don't want to spray them too late because they'll still be there next year, but we're looking at really dry conditions anyway, so there might be a potential chance for a lot of residual herbicide carryover to begin with. So that would be my first thought. The other thing is I get questions a lot about foliar sprays. I'm not saying not to do it. You can still try it. I would recommend, once again, early in the morning. So if you can find a day that's got dew, when was the last time we had heavy dew, but if you can find a day that's, moisture. Anytime there's moisture or fog or something like that, not ideal for spraying, especially Extend or other products in soybeans. But when it comes to foliar feeds, if you're doing it by itself, or maybe with a fungicide or something, it's better in those scenarios because the crop, the leaf itself has more of its stomates open. It has more, I'd say it's more relaxed. It's more able to take that stuff up. It's got more of those open. It can get it into the plant more quickly and efficiently and not waste as much of it. So early in the day, and then it has more time to, absorb it and so forth. So that's my recommendation on foliars. It seems like every year it's kind of sometimes hit or miss, and it just depends on your goals with that. I just think you need to make sure this year, especially with the conditions we have, when the crop's stressed, it's closed up tight. It's trying to limit the amount of exchange gas and moisture and close that down. That's why corn wraps up so much, because it has to keep that exchange going. It's hard for it to really stop and slow things down. Soybeans are a little bit better at that. I should say worse, but a little bit better at it. You'll notice if you ever take the temperature of a soybean plant, it's going to stay cooler during hot summer drought conditions than a corn plant. It's a little more efficient at being inefficient, or more efficient at staying cool in dry conditions, because it's not as efficient of a plant. The other thing I'd say is, this keeps coming back into my mind here, is we have dry conditions. Anytime we have dry conditions, there's an opportunity for spider mites, and that's something that I haven't seen quite yet, but we'll probably likely see at some point. So those are going to come in at the field edges. They're going to kind of creep in. It's pretty easy to find them, especially I've got a white piece of paper here. Taking a white piece of paper with you and going, in the canopy of that soybean and just kind of tapping on the leaves. You'll see the red spider mites, if they're showing up there, and obviously it's pretty easy to tell when they come in. They start really making it look bad on the outside edges. So that's something to keep in mind. The other thing I'd say is on the fungicides side of things, this may be a year where we might want to hold off and not get too excited about fungicides. Fungicides typically do their best when we have disease pressure. Obviously, in a dry year, we don't have the disease pressure out there. Most of those are going to be fungal pathogens, and they need that moisture to work. But in any case, even if there's not a lot of fungal pathogens out there, that even if you're looking for the health benefit, a lot of times in a really dry, extreme drought scenario, if that's where we end up, which it's still kind of looking that way, is not going to provide an added benefit. And a lot of times you actually see a yield decrease. And it can invite, arbitrarily, it can kind of invite some of those insect pests in, because it can really quickly make the field look healthy and be an inviting field compared to your neighboring fields, and invite some of those pests in. So many times in drought conditions, the research shows it actually decreases yield. So I would be cautious on maybe prophylactically spraying fungicides on every field. If you want to try it, try it on a field or two. But if it turns off dry, you're likely not protecting a lot when it comes to the fungicide application, even the health benefit side.
Okay, that's definitely going to be the next step as we continue down this dry path, get later in the season. So, good tips, Phil. Thanks for that. Is there anything else you'd like to leave our listeners with today?
Yeah, just keep in mind, how soybeans respond. That's what I would say. They're so different than corn. We always talk about August rains and making that soybean yield, and that's so true. I mean, when we get to that R4, R5 time period in soybeans, which is typically early August, that's when it really makes or breaks it. We've got so many nodes on the plant, and unfortunately we may reduce that a little bit right now, but we've got potential all throughout reproduction to add more flowers, more pods all the time up until that R5 period. So if we start, if we're still dry going into August, it might be a little bit more gloomy outlook, but soybeans do okay right now in drought. So as long as they're not clamped up or curled over or kind of look like they're dying and wilting, they're probably better off than you think, minus the limited canopy, which would really help reduce some of that evaporation. So.
Okay, consistently amazed with what Mother Nature can do to compensate for all the things that's being thrown our way this year. So thank you, Phil, for great tips today. Thanks, listeners, for tuning in. We'll be back next week with another topic.